right, so we're going to go ahead and have a brief interview between the two readers tonight. And yeah, enjoy.
So you all get to be the interviewers and ask us the questions. Are there any questions? That's your book coming out.
That was a very good question. So, a little fun backstory about my book. It began as a short story when I was a freshman in high school. I'm about to be 26, so I'll let you do the math. But it started as a short story, and I worked on it, for a few years until I realized, wait, I'm supposed to write this book. And so I worked, it was sort of my passion project the whole time I was in school. And so I've given myself a deadline of October 31st, which is happening in, 2.5 more weeks? Yes, to get the next to last draft finished, and then 6 months for revision. So hopefully around this time next year it'll be out. So that's the plan anyway.
Yes.
When do you write the book? Do you do it after your job, or in your job? Do you have another job?
Okay, so the question was, when do I write my book?
Yeah.
I teach college, so I don't work a regular 9-to-5 job. I kind of work little chunks throughout the day. So in between my classes, I do that when my girls are at school. Also quite a bit on the weekends. My husband helps me out by taking care of the family, giving me time to write. So I try to only write when I have at least 3 hours straight to do it, but sometimes I do it when I have less time too. Yeah. That's a good question. The question was, how long did it take me to write it? The first book I started working on about 10 years before I had it finished. And I didn't work on it constantly. It was a lot of thinking about it. And as I was writing the first book, I also started writing the second book, this one. So the first book came out a year ago, August. This one came out a little under 14 months later. So I think my official answer is a little bit under 14 months, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Yeah.
When do you think that the next book will be finished?
Oh, that's a very good question. When will the next book be finished? It actually tells at the back of this book. So the next one, the third part of the trilogy, is called Trouble Fires Burn. It's coming out August 19th of next year. But then I have a surprise book as well that is a standalone book that exists within the same universe. It's called Caliban and the Void. It's I love Caliban as a character, and it's his story. So that is coming out. It says TBA, it means to be announced. So that one's going to be a surprise, but after the next book. Yeah. I'm sorry? Oh yeah, you.
Well, when do you work on it?
When do I work on my book? So I try to write for at least an hour every day, sometimes depending on how busy I am doing other grown-up things. It may or may not happen, but I try to make that a goal. And if I'm not able to do an hour every day, I do have a set goal for myself of no less than 4 hours a week. And so I typically will schedule that in when I'm making my plans for the week in my planner. The key to getting a book written is to schedule time for it, as I'm sure Amber can tell you.
Yeah.
So.
Is you're going to find that most authors have other jobs.
Yeah.
Unless they're already very rich, and so you have to kind of juggle everything in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, so the question was, did it take the same amount of time to write both of my books? I think I spent more time in Cauldron's Bubble, but Double Double Toil was a lot more stressful for me to write. So I think in terms of emotional labor, there was more in the second book. It's darker. If you all know, I'm trained as a screenwriter, and if you all know 3-act structure, the second act is the act where you put your characters up a tree and throw stones at them. So it's a lot less fun to write than the kind of happy beginning, because you're just constantly being mean to your characters. So that's what this book is.
You kind of have to be mean to your characters. It's what keeps the story interesting. So.
Yeah. You in the back.
Do you get inspiration from anything?
Yes. So the question was, did I get inspiration from anything? I got a lot of inspiration from Shakespeare, and the way that that worked out is I would read like Macbeth. And in Macbeth, the witches come on stage and they say, well, what have you been up to lately, sister? And they say, oh, I've been doing a lot of stuff. I cursed a guy in a ship, and I talked to a woman at a market. And then it goes into the story of Macbeth. And so I'd ask myself, well, what was going on? What were the witches actually doing? There's also a great part in Hamlet where Hamlet kind of comes back to Denmark and he tells his friend Horatio, I was kidnapped by pirates, but it all worked out, and I'll tell you about it later. And then everyone dies in Hamlet, so we never get to hear what happens. So that was another thing where I thought, well, what happened with Hamlet and the pirates? And so we find that out in Cauldron's Bubble. That was a good question. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas for what you're going to write after you finish your series, that's a whole book?
Yes, there's another author that I really admire who I'm not gonna say who this author is, but it's someone from the 19th century, and I want to make a series about their books that's kind of similar to this one. So, good. And did you want to ask Nori the same question?
What was the question again?
It was, what are you going to do when you're done with this book?
Right. Okay. So I have a couple ideas for books that I want to write once mine is done. I do have a tentative idea for a sequel to mine, and that one will be geared a little more towards younger readers. The book I'm writing right now is a little more for older kids and adults, but that one will be more for like late elementary, early middle school age. And then I have another book that I am outlining right now that is a retelling of Red Riding Hood. And that's another one I've had in mind for a while, and I'm pretty excited to start working on that.
In the back.
Are you close to like your characters?
Do you mean, like, am I close to them emotionally? Yes, I feel bad when I meet them. But they, at the same time, the characters, and I think most authors would say this, the characters kind of do their own thing. Do you feel like they're out of your control sometimes?
Oh, they just tell me what to do and I write it down.
Yeah. I'd say that our characters are like our friends. You can get them to go out to lunch with you sometimes, but you can't always make them do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
So, good. James, do you have a question?
No.
Okay.
Do you have villains who are original characters in your book, or are they all Shakespearean villains?
I'm about to say a spoiler, so if you don't want to hear this, everyone cover your ears. But this half the audience covers their ears. One of my main villains is Sycorax, who is off stage in The Tempest, and all we really know about her from The Tempest is what Prospero tells us. So she's a Shakespeare-based character in that he made her up.
But you get
But
to fill her
I
out.
gave her voice, so yeah, there was a bit of expansion there. And then the witches they're the bad guys too, so I give Shakespeare credit for them as well. Yes?
This is a question for both of you, but do you have anything in common with your characters?
Do you want to go first or?
Sure. I think I have a lot in common with Rosie, who's my main character, in the sense that we both had similar upbringings raised by our grandmothers, and that we both are interested in a lot of the same things like music and fairies and the color pink. But Rosie is not me. She is her own person, if that makes sense, even though she came out of my brain, and we do have quite a bit in common. I see her as a little bit of sort of my alter ego. Like if I had lived a different life, we might have been sisters or something, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good explanation. My main character, Alda, lives in the town where I grew up in Michigan. Grand Ledge is a real town, but she lives there 100 years before I did. So I never got to experience her world. I say that's the most we have in common, though. Her name, Alda, is derived from my daughter's names. So it's the first two letters of my oldest daughter's name and the last two letters of my youngest daughter's name. And she shares some traits with both of them, too. But it's never 100% based on any one person. I do give my husband credit for inspiring Dren quite a bit. So, as he's blushing quite a bit. But a lot of Dren comes from him. So I do take stuff from people that I know in real life, but it's never 100%. Good. What other questions? Anyone? Yes?
So when you a trilogy? Do you set out to write the trilogy? Or does it, I'm always interested in how that develops. Do you write one and then you're inspired to write the second as you're doing it, or do you have the whole thing in mind?
So I can't speak for everyone, but for myself, it was something planned out. I've known the end the entire time. I know what we call the plot points in screenwriting, like you know what happens for the inciting incidents and the first act curtain, and I knew the things that were going to happen in the second book, and I know the ultimate end. But as I'm going, I do add stuff too, and sometimes I'll be driving in my car and I'll think of something like, oh, it's a really good idea, I need to go back and add that. And because I'm publishing as a trilogy, if it's something that should have been in the first book, there's nothing I can do about it, so it doesn't get added. But I think that that's probably the appeal of writing one longer book, that you can go back and edit it before you get to the end, whereas I just have to keep on moving forward. Yes?
So it's like one big evil plan, like, and then you'll kill, and then it's like, that you'll kill them succeed in the end?
Well, we don't know if they succeed, but I do know where they're going. So here's something to make you worry a little bit. Shakespeare wrote 3 kinds of plays. He wrote comedies, where people get married at the end. He would write tragedies, where everyone died at the end. And then he wrote romances, which is what The Tempest is. And in a romance, there's some bad stuff that happens, and some people are very unhappy, and some people are less unhappy than others. I don't want to necessarily say it's always a happy ending, but there's a mix of happiness and sadness at the end. So I am not going to answer this question for you, but it's up to the audience to kind of decide if my books are a tragedy, a comedy, or a romance. And at the end of the 3rd one, you'll know. But up until then, it's going to remain mysterious.
A little bit of all.
Yes.
Mixed in.
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do to change your mind about the end of the
Oh,
3rd one?
I will say my husband's the only one who knows the ultimate ending, and he's already trying to influence me, but it's not going to work. But I promise not everyone dies. Although my oldest daughter pointed out that everyone does die in real life. So eventually the characters will die. But whether or not I kill them tragically is a different matter.
Whether they die already.
Yes. Or they die of old age 50 years after the book ends. Who knows? Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you all for coming again. There's snacks. Thank you for those, Malvern. And then there are copies of my books. They're already signed, but if you want me to personalize them, you can come and find me. And I have fancy pens that I can write them with. But thanks, everyone, for coming out today. We appreciate it.